Well, let's elaborate a little bit on short-term memory now that we've gotten past sensory memory. Is there anything that distinguishes short-term memory from long-term memory except capacity? Well, there have to be other things. So, for instance, psychologists who make the distinction believe there are a number of such things, such as how much information could be stored, which is capacity, the form, the coding. We will discuss, or you'll see a clip later, about the nature of letters that sound alike and how much more difficult it is to store those together versus words or letters that sound different. So we'll also begin to look at traditional description of short-term memory and describe this idea of a separate concept, kind of, called working memory that merits its own, I guess you could say, advertisement or its own category. So this is from George Miller, a person who asserted this idea of there being a limited capacity on short-term memory. And forgive this long quote, but his problem was that he's been persecuted by an integer. For 7 years, this number has followed me around and has intruded my private data, salted me from the pages of our public journals, and it assumes many disguises. And what he's saying is, basically, there is a limit on our short-term memory of maybe 7 plus or minus 2 characters. And that's the capacity limit on our short-term memory as revealed for a handful of experiments. So if I read you a list of numbers, and if you'll indulge, I'll read some numbers in order. 1 7 7 6 1 8 1 2 1 9 1 4 1 9 4 1 1 9 6 5. That's a lot of numbers. That was 20 numbers. And apparently had no rhyme or reason. Basically, people often run out of gas pretty soon after 1776 because we're plagued by a limited capacity. So the integer plaguing Miller was 7 plus or minus 2, among other things. 7 plus or minus 2 seems to be the maximum number of units we can hold. So a solution to that might be chunking. And here are those numbers that I just read. How might those numbers be chunked? Well, of course, you can see it jumps off the page now. These are, I don't know if it'll let me adjust there it is. Typeface. The beginning years of major wars that the United States participated in. So, Revolutionary, 1812, Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the beginning of the Vietnam conflict in 65. So I have a lot of characters there, and in fact, that's actually 24 characters. But once we chunk them down into 6 units, it's a piece of cake. So our capacity is greater than we think, as your text mentions this example from that has to do with FBI and TWA, something like that. It can be done pretty easily. Now, if you think of the capacity of your short-term memory in your social security number, your social is divided 324. Your phone number, area code first, is 334. And why is that? Well, or your student number may be chunkable into 4 and 4. And the reason that is because we're interested in having people remember these numbers. We would like to have people know their social off the top of their heads for employment reasons and for voting and a lot of other things. So in that case, of course, we can reduce things down to elements that are more easily recalled. But if you had to remember 20 straight numbers, it'd be kind of hard, 24 straight numbers. So we've got a finite limit on capacity with respect to short-term memory. Coding refers to the way in which information is mentally represented. And when you try to remember a phone number, as in the preceding example, how do you represent it? It's kind of hard. Now, there's a video that follows this one in the notes, in the folder, that describes the way that we code even when we read. And generally speaking, we code in such a way that's verbal, even though we're just reading it silently. And as you'll see in the next example, things that have a long E sound like P, G, and C are harder to remember in order than words or letters such as FWK because they don't sound alike. So there's some sort of mental representation of a visual stimulus, indeed a phonemic representation of that visual stimulus that's hard to spit out later, which suggests something about how we code things. Even when we come across words or letters in silence, our inner ear is processing those as though we're reading them out loud. And that's a fascinating aspect of how we code information and recall it later, as you'll see in the video clip that speaks to one of my Cog Lab experiments.